Right.
Okay, you are live.
All right. Well, we can call this meeting of the Salem Airport Advisory Commission to order. I don't know, Linda, do you want to roll us through the roll call?
I'd be happy to. John Foley,
Present.
Nathan Edgecombe. He said he would not be here this evening. Doug
Right. Well, we can call this meeting of the Salem
Brenazar, I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. Pat Pence.
Here.
Nathan Edgecombe. Christopher Burkholder.
Here.
Mike Morrow. Doug.
Here.
Arnaud Burstuff.
Here.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Is anybody else getting a little bit of delay feedback? Like it's like about 2 or 3 seconds back.
Yes.
Right.
Here.
Arnaud Burstuff.
Yeah, here we go. I don't know if I don't know where that's coming from. If that's something you have any control over, Linda?
I'm going to work on that right now. I apologize.
Okay, well, we can soldier on in the meantime. I don't know if you wanted to, if we wanted to do some introductions here, John, I think you, oh, you're muted.
Of course, I'm muted. Linda, if you want to mute your microphone just to see if we will stop with the feedback, that might help. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to introduce Councillor Nishioka, our Ward 2 councillor. This is her first time attending an Airport Advisory Commission meeting, so we welcome her. She will be the council liaison to the Airport Advisory Commission going forward. So welcome, Councillor.
Yeah, wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you very much. I am looking forward to this meeting and the future meetings, and I'm glad to have been assigned this commission.
It's an exciting time, I think.
Yep, and then, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce, before we get to that point in the agenda, I'll introduce Kevin Mulcaster and Marika Armstrong, both from Mead & Hunt, the airport's planning firm. And they are, Marika is the project manager for the airport master plan. And I believe Kevin is well, I'll let Kevin tell us what he is. I'm not sure what your title is anymore, Kevin.
Well, probably most importantly, John, I was the project manager of your last master plan. But I manage our Northwest Aviation business unit here at Mead & Hunt, and excited to be here tonight.
Awesome. Well, we're looking forward to both your presentations. So I guess if there's no other introductions, if we can move on to the approval of the agenda for this meeting. Has everyone received it and had a chance to review the agenda? All right, could I get a motion to approve the agenda as distributed?
So moved.
All
Second.
right. Awesome. We have a motion and a second. Thank you. We'll do a roll call vote, and I'll start with Doug Brenizer. Do you approve the agenda as distributed?
Yes.
Kat Pence?
Yes.
Christopher Burkholder?
Yes.
Mike Morrow?
Yes.
Arnaud Verstoif?
Yes.
And then John Foley votes yes as well. All right, so that would be the agenda. So the next item would be approving the minutes from the last meeting. Has everyone received and reviewed the minutes from the March 15th meeting?
Yes.
Any corrections or adjustments needed to those? All right, hearing none, if someone could move to approve the minutes as distributed.
I move.
And a second?
Second.
All right, then we'll do another roll call vote. Doug Brenizer,
Yes.
Kat Pence,
Yes.
Christopher Burkholder,
Yes.
Mike Morrow.
Sorry. Yes.
All right, Arnaud Verstoif,
Aye.
and John Foley votes yes as well. All right, so we've approved the agenda and the minutes. The next item on the agenda is public comment. John, I am not aware of any public comments that we've received for this meeting.
I did not receive any.
All right, so if there's no public comment, we can move on to the next agenda item, which is the presentation from Marika Armstrong on the airport master plan update. You can take it away.
Thank you. Okay, let me share my screen here. Oh, it says host disabled participants sharing
Yeah, Linda, can you give Marika the opportunity to share? I don't know how to do that. Please. Maybe I had to say please. Sorry, I didn't think about that ahead of time, Marika.
Yeah, that's okay.
I wonder,
Are you still
wonder
there?
if she
Is it-
stepped away.
I made
Oh,
both you, John,
no.
and Marika co-host. I think that will do the trick.
I think I've got it now. Can you see the screen?
Looks great.
All right, let's move this over here. Okay. Thank you. As John said, I'm Marika Armstrong, and I'm the project manager for the Salem Airport Master Plan that is underway now. And I'm here to give you an update on the process and the schedule. So this is today's agenda. We're going to cover the initial elements of our master plan. So we have an overview, existing conditions, environmental considerations, aviation forecasts, facility requirements a little bit, and the next steps of the master plan. So an airport master plan is a comprehensive study of an airport, and it provides the framework that guides future airport development. It's a 20-year plan, usually updated every 10 years, and describes the short, medium, and long-term development plans to meet future aviation demand. Identifies capital improvement projects and updates the airport layout plan. And the master plan is required to receive FAA grant funding. Some of the goals of the Salem Airport Master Plan are to evaluate runway and taxiway geometry and the existing infrastructure, both on their ability to meet FAA requirements and design standards and their ability to accommodate projected growth. So the master plan will develop alternatives that meet those requirements and design standards and provide for long-term planning and financial resiliency. We also, what's unique to this master plan is the evaluation of the future of the additional runway 1634 and reintroduction of commercial service at Salem Airport. So you can see here, this is the schedule of the major elements of the master plan and the primary questions that will be answered as we move through the approximate 20-month process. We anticipate a final master plan in the summer of 2024. We have completed our draft inventory and existing conditions and the draft environmental chapters, and they've been circulated to our planning advisory committee. We're currently working on developing the forecast, which is one of the two elements that requires FAA approval. The other is the airport layout plan. So those are the two decision-making points for the FAA during the master plan process. The airport layout plan serves as a graphical representation of the existing and future airport development. We anticipate completing the forecast this summer and then submitting them for FAA approval. The facility requirements and alternative chapters will be completed in the fall following our completion of the forecasted demand. Our planning advisory committee meeting is scheduled for next Tuesday, the first one following the kickoff meeting, which was back in December. Subsequent planning advisory committees, city council meeting and public meeting will occur after facility requirements in the beginning of the alternatives, which is projected in the fall, and then another round of meetings in the winter indicated by the dots at the top of the schedule. So the first chapter, existing conditions, we looked at all the airport facilities, both on the air side and land side, and provided an inventory and documented the existing conditions of the airport as they are today. And then the second chapter is the environmental overview. It provided a high-level overview of all these resource areas as shown here, to identify the existing environmental conditions that will be considered during evaluation of future development alternatives for the airport. This chapter is not intended to satisfy the requirements of the National Environmental Policy Act, but rather assist in avoidance and minimization of environmental effects as we move forward and develop alternatives. Section 4F, some may not be familiar. It refers to the U.S. Department of Transportation Act of 1966 section, and it takes into consideration publicly owned parklands, recreation areas, wildlife and waterfowl refuges, and also publicly or privately owned historic sites. So that's just one more element that we looked at. So we've started to look at the forecast, aviation activity forecast, evaluate the project and project future demand at an airport using 10 years of historic data, and then forecast over a period of 20 years from now. The forecasts at Salem consider socioeconomics and the aviation market, both statewide and nationally. And the completed chapter will include each of the elements shown here in this list. Oops, excuse me. Shown here is a preliminary general aviation forecast. It shows the history behind the red line and then forecasted operations over the next 20 years using a variety of methods. These will be narrowed down into a preferred forecast. We will undergo this same sort of process for commercial operations, which will be based on growth indications of low-cost carriers in similar markets, accounting for seasonality, historical load factors of low-cost carriers, and possible destinations. And these forecasts accommodate the future growth of the airport. This, as I said earlier, this chapter requires FAA approval, and it's one of those two decision points, the other being the airport layout plan. Following the forecast, we'll start to get into facility requirements. Facility planning is largely driven by criteria and standards developed by the FAA that emphasize safety and efficiency while protecting federal investment in airport transportation infrastructure, demand for services, and the airport's vision of its aviation and community roles. Most of these standards are based on approach categories and design groups of the critical aircraft. The airport's future critical aircraft is determined by the forecasts and is defined as demanding aircraft that conducts 500 or more annual operations. Facility requirements will evaluate these elements shown here: the design standards, demanding capacity, runway length, aeronautical and non-aeronautical facilities, the terminal, and we'll also look at the potential for electric aircraft facilities. And we'll determine whether the existing conditions of the airport as defined in the first chapter will meet the requirement, will meet the projected existing and future demand, and then what changes will be necessary to meet that demand. So one of the components unique to this master plan is the future of runway 1634. The runway is no longer eligible for FAA funding, and the FAA had asked Salem to analyze this additional runway. The master plan, the future maintenance would need to be entirely funded by the city without FAA funding. So what are the potential considerations and opportunities for the city? And this is there's much more to consider beyond just the pavement of the runway itself. So there's also all of these things in the list: the taxiway pavement, the geometry of the taxiway and taxi lanes, the aprons, nav aids and lighting and electrical along the runways, development opportunities and also existing obstructions. So ultimately, the city will need to make a decision on the future of runway 1634 before we move into the alternatives chapter, since if they decide to close the runway or keep the runway, that greatly affects the land available on the airport for both for future aeronautical and non-aeronautical development. And so the next steps, as I said, we've completed the existing conditions and environmental considerations chapters, and we're moving into the aviation forecast chapter this summer. Facility requirements and alternatives in the fall, and then sometime late in the year, we'll have our second round of meetings and our second planning advisory committee and city council meetings and our first public meeting. So that's all I have. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I have one question. Could you go back a couple slides? There's a word that I'm just not familiar with, and I just one more, please. So
This one?
yes, on the last column on the right, the middle word.
The avigation easements.
What is that?
So that's an easement over land to protect the approach of an aircraft.
Okay, thank you. That was just a new one.
Yeah.
I have another question, I guess, and then maybe this is also for John. It sounds like, at least in this runway 1634 analysis, it sounds like that we're pushing for a decision to be made on the future of that in the context of this master plan. So I guess in the next, 12 months, we would be.
Yeah, so maybe, thank you, Mr. Chairman, maybe a little bit of background for those that are fairly new to the commission. What prompted the master plan update, because originally it was scheduled for 2025. The FAA moved up the funding to 2022 because in a joint planning conference we had with them in late 2019, just before COVID, they started asking a lot of questions about this runway, the geometries of the associated taxiways, the obstruction removal on the approaches, the lack of developable property on the airport for future. We're required to maintain enough future developable property for aviation growth. And so there were a lot of conversations around this runway that we really didn't have answers for, other than it currently exists, and we like to keep it, and it's handy to have, and all that sort of thing. So they asked us to take this question up as part of this master plan update. So it's really, I guess you could almost say that it's the driver for the FAA's interest in us updating our master plan. As Marika indicated, we're really at a point now, sure, she's getting to a point in the master plan development where the city's going to be at a literal fork in the road. It's going to have to decide whether it wants to preserve this runway, and if so, there's going to be a variety of projects that are going to go with that. Taxiway realignments, obstruction removals, there are lots of different things. And if they choose to close the runway, there's going to be a whole bunch of costs and projects associated with that. As far as access to new developable property and relocation of hangars and lots of things like that. So we're going to have to. We're getting close to a point. Maybe Kevin can jump in. He did a good summary the other day for another meeting we were in. But we're going to have to go to City Council at some point with really two separate, I guess, costs or projects. I'm not sure how you want to state it, Kevin, but have the city make the decision on the future of that runway, understanding all of the requirements, regardless of which direction they go, because then we can plan that direction. We don't want to do two separate alternatives for if we keep the runway, or if we don't keep the runway, because there's not enough funding to do separate alternatives for two separate potential future growth. So I'll let Kevin jump in and kind of do a better job of explaining that piece.
You did really well, John. I guess the way that I'm looking at this is we either in either scenario, there's an investment that's going to have to be made by the airport in the city of Salem. And our job is really to provide a long-term plan for both scenarios so that the city decision makers can be informed with the right information to make the appropriate decision that's best for the city of Salem and the airport. And really, I thought Marika did a really good job of trying to explain, kind of the totality of the decision. It's simple to look out there and say, yep, we gotta make a decision about the future of this runway, but it's so much more than that. I appreciated the question about the navigation easement. That's a significant challenge related to 1634 because there's a lot of airspace that runway requires control over to prevent whether it's vegetative growth, whether it's development or a cell tower or whatever it may be that may limit the viability of that runway in the future. And so really those are the things that we're looking at in both scenarios. What would it cost to maintain this over a 20-year cycle, understanding that that's going to be an infinite investment, right? So you make that decision, you go through the 20-year maintenance cycle on that runway and you get to year 20 and guess what? You're starting back again at year 1. And then the same thing is true for the opposite scenario. If the runway goes away, what is the investment that it's going to take? It's not as simple as just ripping up that pavement. There's a lot of sequencing of work and opportunities to develop a new path or a new future for the airport with the opportunities that with that runway going away. What are the benefits? What are the operational impacts to users that may prefer that runway? There's a lot to consider. And so our job really in the master plan, and this will be kind of an appendice to it, is to prepare that information, decision-making document to provide really a comprehensive understanding of both scenarios of not only what it may cost, but what the pros and cons, the benefits may be to, and the takeaways may be for both users of the airport, and then also what opportunities there may be for reinventing what that opportunity could be in either scenario for the airport. So there's and as Marika said, this is very important to us as we move into alternatives, because it is, the decisions that we have to make to align ourselves with FAA design requirements are substantially different if that runway remains versus if it goes away. And so what we don't want to do is get into a situation where we're developing a 20-year plan for multiple scenarios of what could happen. And this is certainly not an easy decision by any means. But it's also one that, isn't going to, a solution is not going to present itself, I guess, in terms of making that decision in either direction. The improvements that go with it in either scenario are not, a single project. They're going to be years of work to get to, the ultimate configuration, whether the runway stays or goes.
Right. If I could follow up, where does this, going back to your timeline of where we have parts of the report that are going to be reviewed and shared for at least advisory committee comment, or maybe not advisory committee comment, but planning committee comment and public comment. Where does this fall into? Is it in the winter 2024 timeframe is where we would see that? Or, and I'm asking because at least in the conversations I've had with airport users, it's that runway is pretty, this will be a thing that will generate a lot of public comment, I would think. And so whatever decision process that gets made there, people are going to ask questions about it. And so I guess if it can be, the more light we can shed on it and the reasons why people are making those decisions, that would be helpful, I think, for getting everybody on board.
Marika, let me jump in there real quick. Okay. I guess number one, we absolutely want to be transparent with this. This is not something that we want to do in a vacuum. And again, our job as your consultant is to provide you the information to help make an informed decision. I guess in terms of timing of this, it's a complex issue. It requires a lot of analysis. I expect that we will be grinding on this particular element through the summer. And I would expect, as Marika indicated, we really need to reach that decision point sometime between facility requirements wrapping up and alternatives, getting started. And so looking at the schedule here, it's probably a fall discussion that we'll be looking to have that conversation.
Excellent. Thank you. That answers my question.
I will,
Yeah, other comments? I guess Councilor Nishoka has her hand up and Arnaud has a hand up. Let's do the Councilor Nishoka first.
Thank you. Because I'm coming late to the party, what I appreciate is the map that shows the 2 runways. And I'd like to understand if 1634 is being used and by whom, and is the thought that you would then change the direction of if we did another runway? I'm just trying to understand what the roadmap is as far as if that one is taken away, are you adding another? And it sounded like you needed a longer one. So I'm just trying to understand if somebody could catch me up.
John, if I can take just a real quick second just to kind of explain the reasoning behind, I guess, the FAA perspective on that second runway before you can maybe talk about who uses it. But the FAA is looking at this solely in terms of what their criteria is for different types of either a secondary runway, a crosswind runway, or an auxiliary runway. And this runway, unfortunately, doesn't meet any of those criteria, and that's why it's no longer funded. The primary driver for an additional well, there's 2 primary drivers. One is simply a capacity need. If there's enough operations that requires a second runway, they will support it. The second is based on wind coverage, and they look at where the wind is blowing predominantly, and if it reaches a certain percent threshold, they will say you only need a single runway unless you have this secondary need, which is a capacity driven issue. And in this case, I forget, Marika, what the exact percentages are, but the threshold is 95%. If the wind's blowing down the runway at the primary runway, which is 1331, if it's blowing down that runway 95% or more, then the support for that secondary 1634 crosswind runway, what I think is what it used to be called as a crosswind, is no longer there. And the wind coverage on 1331 is, in the 98, 99% percentile range. It far exceeds the threshold of 95%. So that's why the FAA is looking at this. And so in terms of an additional runway, I don't think there's there would be another plan to add another runway. It's simply not supported by the FAA. Now, if the city decides to maintain it on its own, there's no rule that says the city of Salem couldn't do that. It's just something that they're going to have to fund on their own.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. That's really good. And you're going back decades, sort of a little bit of backstory and a little history about airports in the United States. After World War II, there was a requirement that airports had to maintain all of the existing infrastructure for national defense, essentially. And so for the longest time, the FAA paid to preserve all of the existing infrastructure at airports across the country. Obviously, that need has gone away now with modern technology, and the funding program, the AIP, the Airport Improvement Program funding pot, continues to get smaller and smaller, and it gets spread over, obviously much larger airports get the lion's share of that money. So the FAA is looking for ways, not just in Salem, this is nationwide, to right size airports, to look at extraneous infrastructure that doesn't meet some criteria any longer, and they won't fund that anymore. They can't force you to close a runway or do anything to your airport. It's not their airport, it's the city's airport, but they can determine where their funding goes to, and that typically is a driver for what airports decide to do. Airports in our configuration, there are dozens and dozens of them across the country, some right here in Oregon. And if you look through a lot of the airfield maps, the geometries now, most of their secondary or even tertiary, some of them had a third runway going kind of across the other two. Most of those have been closed over the years, primarily the same reason that this one is on the table. It's expensive to continue to maintain all of those. They're not needed. All the lighting systems and pavement, asphalt maintenance and all of that becomes cost prohibitive at some point. And then, of course, it opens up property for additional revenue generating development. So from a business perspective, a lot of airports have taken that opportunity to use that property for a higher and better use, a revenue producing use. So those are kind of some of the discussions that I think the city is going to have to balance. In terms of who uses that runway, Councilor, it's a very popular runway. A couple of pilots on here can speak to that better than I can. I'm not an active pilot anymore, but 1634, you'll notice, especially on the south end, which is the 3-4 end, you'll notice on the left side, which is the west side of the airport, there's a lot of hangars up and down the west side. And so it's easy on a small aircraft to land on 3-4, taxi off, a quarter, a third of the way down that runway, make a left turn and go to the restaurant or go back to your hangar, go to the FBO and get fuel. So it's very convenient to land there, circle back around, take off, that sort of thing. It's a longer taxi to and from the other runway. So there's fuel burn considerations, there's wear and tear on tires, et cetera, et cetera. So and from an airport management perspective, it's nice to have because, in fact, we're getting ready to close the primary runway for a month because the FAA is doing some maintenance on its lighting system. And so I have another runway that we can keep operational and we don't have to close the airport to fixed wing operations for a month. So there's a benefit there, of course, too. And in an emergency or in an accident scenario, we have a secondary runway, which you may not have like at Aurora or places like that. So there's a lot of benefit to that runway. There's also a lot of expense to that runway, and that's kind of a big picture of the push and pull that we're going to have to look at. And I say we, the city of Salem, is going to have to make those considerations.
Thank you. That was very helpful, John.
All right, Arnaud, you've been very patient, and then I see several other hands raised. I saw Doug's and then Chris's. So we'll start with Arnaud and then head on down to the other folks.
Thank you, John. We heard about related costs and about land availability. What hasn't been mentioned is the effect on the neighborhoods. One of the advantages I see of the secondary runway is that it avoids residential areas. So I'm wondering if it's taken into consideration what the effect will be of the extra pressure that will be put on the residential areas in the northwest corner of the airport.
Are you're referring to overflight and noise?
That
If
will be
all
one
of the
Mhm.
Yeah, if all of the operations are on 1331, yes. I mean, that's something that that we will look at. We will model that noise to see what changes in the contour and in overflight and flight patterns would be. So that's definitely a consideration. And then I think you mentioned a really interesting perspective of this in terms of the zoning that goes on around the airport, the overlay zone that the airport has. Those are some of the things that we were kind of alluding to in that 1634 analysis, that it's so much bigger than just the pavement that's on the ground. There's a lot of other things that we've got to think about.
Thank you, Kevin.
Doug, I think you were up next.
Oh, okay.
I was
Yeah,
on
sorry.
mute. Yeah, Doug, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. So I one of the things I don't see, and I don't know if it's part of the this exercise or not. 2 years ago, correct me if I'm wrong on the date, John, we narrowed runway 1331. And the next step would be to move the lights in, and it becomes now a 100-foot runway rather than a 150-foot runway, which means it's limited to 737s. That's the largest airplane you can land there. So is this part of, are we even considering running the width back out? And John, also a secondary question. I know that we've taken FAA money for 1634 in the past, and we have to operate it for a certain period of time as a result of having taken that money. Do you know that date?
So a couple of things. To your first question, the runway overlay for the primary runway was in 2018. And you are correct that the FAA and their effort to right-size airports only funded the 100-foot keel section. The 25-foot shoulders on either side were not grant eligible for that project. The airport paid to crack seal as a maintenance program, crack seal those 25-foot shoulders to preserve them for the next decade or more. But that is not an eligible sized runway for this airport any longer. You'll find as we go through the master plan here too, this is broaching a whole different subject, that taxiway widths are also changing. Some of the older widths that the FAA used to use for wingspan type, that wingspan was the driver for the width requirements, and they've moved to a gear configuration now. So a lot of taxiways that are now 50 feet wide at the Salem Airport would only be eligible for a 35-foot wide taxiway. So you can see if you extrapolate that reduced pavement over the course of the United States and the thousands of airports that the FAA funds, that becomes a lot of pavement that we either don't need. And in fact, it's interesting, if you look at an overhead of the airport, if you're out taxiing, you can see the wear down the center line of the kind of the center 35 feet of the taxiways, and they tend to stay black out on the outside because they never get used. So you can almost see kind of where the pavement width needs to be. But that's just another back to the runway question, Doug. That's the shoulders are something that the city can continue to maintain on its own dime long term if it wants to. And if it doesn't want to, if we can't afford it, at some point it'll become a 100-foot wide runway, and there would be a project probably in the next overlay a decade or so from now where we'd move the lights in. It would be 100-foot wide. As to what the maximum size aircraft is that could land on 100 feet, that's a category of aircraft. Kevin would have to jump in on those specifics, but I want to say it would be up to a C3, or can we even get D size aircraft on 100 feet wide, Kevin? Can't quite
Find my mute button. Sorry. No, I think you're correct. It's C3. I can double check that, but that's my recollection as well. Yeah, to answer your question, yes, we would be looking at those opportunities as a part of this master plan, and more than likely, that's going to be based on current operations and in terms of what design standards are, and your next runway project. Absolutely, that would be something that we would be looking at in terms of the width. We want to make sure that as the as the airport evolves, as operations evolve, that we're taking that into consideration at that time. I mean, this is the master plan is a little bit of a static document. As Marika said earlier, we want to update it about every 10 years, but it's just a guide. It's not chapter and verse of how we're going to develop the airport, in stone forever. So each one of these projects that are identified, if there's a need that changes, the FAA is receptive to that conversation.
And thank you, Kevin. To your other question, Doug, grant funding on 1634 for the pavement, I'd have to look back and see. I think it's past the 20-year mark that there's been any money put into the pavement. The FAA did allow us to replace the lights and signs on that runway when we did the entire airfield electrical system removal and replacement back in 2014. They did allow that runway at that time. I don't think they were meant to. I don't think they realized that they weren't supposed to. But that aside, it's there. They paid for it. But after the fact, a couple of years later, I was reminded that is not a grant eligible runway anymore. So you got that one, but there won't be any more. Lighting systems, I believe, are 10 years, Kevin. So we're coming up on about almost 10 years for that lighting system. Now, it's Salem. It'll last 10 more years or more. And so will the pavement, more than likely. So it's not that the runway's in such poor condition or coming apart that we can't preserve it and use it indefinitely. We likely can. The other questions will remain. And what the questions that the FAA asked us in the joint planning conference that precipitated this whole discussion, i.e., when are you going to realign your taxiways to meet modern design standards? That's multi-million-dollar taxiway realignments to keep that runway, and that's fundable. It's also we have to come up with a match for that. Obstruction removal, some of the other things, the ancillary things that Marika and Kevin talked about that don't have anything to do with the pavement or the lighting system are going to have to be addressed as well. So it's much more than just do we keep it or don't we keep it. It's the costs and the benefits for both directions. But we are, I guess it's a long way to answer your question to say that we are beyond any requirement to keep that runway based on a grant, any grants that were used, or at least we're getting close to that. I think the other thing I might add is there's sort of a perception. I've had to sort of shunt this discussion several times because obviously we're not at a decision point, and it's not our decision; it's the city's decision. City of Salem, they're the decision makers. I think there's a thought that if the decision is made that that runway ultimately will go away, that bulldozers will show up the next day and we start taking all the infrastructure out. That's not likely to be the case. It's likely to be a phased program along with all of the other infrastructure that would have to be either taken out or put back in. And we're talking about a 20-year planning document here. So that runway could exist theoretically for another 10 years before anybody even thought about touching it. It could be some taxiway realignments and some other infrastructure removals and replacements that happen years before the runway ever gets considered. We don't know that. That's what the facilities alternatives chapter would look at. And I've asked the consultants to do a phasing. They typically do phasing programs so that we can plan ahead for which phases happen when. So people would know when that date certain would be if that's the decision the city makes. But it won't be an immediate just bulldoze everything, plant grass and leave it as is. Obviously, we can't run an airport that way. So that's this piece I like to share with people. There's a lot of misperception and miscommunication being spread around out there. So.
Okay. Chris, I think you've been waiting patiently to ask or speak. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. I just had one small comment. I guess it's more for people who aren't in aviation consistently, but speaking about runways, 1634 is a misnomer. Pilots talk about it as 1634. And if we're having public comment, especially those that have pilots and people heavily in aviation, I think you'll have a lot more credibility if you stick with calling it 1634 versus 1634. That was my only comment. Just the other side comment, I do fly 737s. We do operate on the 100-foot runways. But taxiways, when they get squeezed down to 35 feet, get a little snug. So you increase dropping a wheel off the edge of a taxiway and getting a 737 out of the mud on a edge of a taxiway is a little bit more than just backing it up and kicking it in 4-wheel drive. But I think there's a lot of good discussion. I just want to say as we're continuing to have public comments and maintain credibility if we continue to use, especially with the aviation community, if we use the 1634 nomenclature.
All right, thank you. Any other comment on the presentation? Questions?
Oh, following up, Mr. Chairman, from Chris's comment, it's interesting he mentioned that because yesterday I had a meeting with the airline operations folks talking about ramp layouts, pushback, opportunities, taxiway Charlie, the movement line, all of this operational logistical stuff. And they said the very same thing, that we've got quite a bit of space out here at Salem. They've got some airports where they get pushed back out of the ramp and they're on narrow taxiways and they're really, really, really close to having a wheel in the grass or in the dirt. And that's not their favorite thing. So that would be another situation, I think, similar to the runway where, if the city says, well, we like our 50-foot wide taxiways, that we can keep those. The FAA may only fund the center 35 feet of pavement rehabilitation, but we could certainly plan to fund the shoulders and keep the infrastructure we have. So it's sort of generally another piece. And I think it's important for Councilor Nishioka to understand too, that none of this discussion is anybody trying to remove anything or shrink anything or right size anything. It's the FAA really saying this is what we fund now and this is why we fund it or don't fund it. And if you like what you have, it's your airport. You can pay to keep it for as long as you choose. It's just going to be on your nickel. And so that's a financial planning exercise that the city would have to make and determine where that revenue would come from. If the users like all the infrastructure, then maybe the users are going to have to look at what the fees that they're being charged. That would be a city council decision. So there's going to be a lot more to it than just do we close it or do we not close it? It's much, much more complicated than that. And it's good that we're having these discussions now.
I will look forward to hearing about the money.
Yeah, that'll be a key piece, I think, when we get to the decision point. We had originally planned for Marika to do a presentation on the 22nd to City Council, but that staff report's been pulled. That update's been canceled. We're going to do the PAC meeting on the 23rd, and then I think when we get to, I think the city wants to get to a discussion place about this topic, because this is obviously the topic that everybody's interested in, the sort of not just the runway, but the taxiways and all of the bits and pieces. So as Mead and Hunt puts together both scenarios, there'll be a time that I think we'll probably have some internal discussions, and then we'll maybe have some small council meetings and go forward from there, and then talk about it publicly and get all the input and everything. So there's a lot more to come for sure.
Yeah, it may be that you might need to have a couple of focus groups first so that it can be understood. And so anyway, but that I think Mark Bechtel and Keith Staley would give you guidance on that.
Yep, I think that's wise. And I think because it's such a complicated topic and not a lot of people have a lot of experience in airport planning and airport management and operations, other than pilots and sort of airport people, it's good to have some documents to show some information rather than just sort of these broad discussions that we're having now. It'll be better when there's really more data to look at and decisions to be made. Thank you. Thanks, guys and gals.
All right. If there's no more comments on the presentation, I think we can move on to the next agenda item, which is the reports. And I believe, John, you had a report that you distributed. I don't know if everybody had a chance to read that and if there was any discussion we wanted to have on that report, or John, if there was anything you wanted to speak to.
Yeah, a couple of things, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. And Kevin and Marika, if you want to stay on, you're welcome to listen to the rest of this. It won't be real long. If you don't, thank you for your time this evening away from your families, and we appreciate it. And we'll look forward to talking to you soon.
Yeah, thank you
Thank
very much.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. So Rob wasn't able to join tonight. He did send me a very, very short, very brief tower notes. There wasn't not a lot to report. January through, let's see, how was it? January through April, we had that meeting. Oh yeah, we're in May. So January through April, traffic count year to date, 12,672. Busiest day in that period was 297 operations, which is pretty robust. I always compare it to the, I think it was the 2017 solar eclipse. I think that day we had 425 operations. That's our high water mark, I believe, for one day. So 297 is pretty good for a non-eclipse day. Don't know which day that was. They'd had no mandatory occurrence reports in March or April, which is great. So no laser pointing things, no emergency calls or anything like that. And he has one controller in training. I believe he's going to be fully staffed here when this person is all trained up. We've got a couple of retired PDX FAA controllers now that are looking to retire in Salem. So I think we're going to have a stable long-term tower staff again here going forward. That was all that Rob shared with me today. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to jot them down and take them back to Rob.
Any questions on that? Any questions on the airport manager report that was distributed with the minutes or the agenda?
And before we get to questions, Mr. Chairman, I do want to add one more thing because it came up last night. I mentioned earlier that I was in the City Planning Commission meeting last evening, and the purpose for that was that Commissioner Slater is interested in addressing City Council and wanted to make a motion, and I'll just read the motion and the discussion. He moved that the Planning Commission send to the City Council an attached letter, and I'll include the letter in the minutes. Which encourages the city to undertake a feasibility study for the installation of solar panels, battery storage, and a microgrid at the Salem Airport, and to include that feasibility study as part of the airport's master plan update if the funding can be located. So the Planning Commission voted unanimously. They thought it was a great idea. Commissioner Slater has done a very, very impressive job of going through the FAA's guidance on solar panels and solar farms on airports, understanding the requirements, the costs, the amount of storage that can generally be that can be generated from certain number of panels, and what that can fund. He's looked at airports across the country that are fully funded electrically by their own solar farms and then have enough extra power, to share with the larger grid. So he's done a fantastic job of that. I'm impressed. He asked me if I was okay with him sending this letter to the council. I absolutely supported that. I appreciate that somebody's doing all of that extra work that unfortunately we just don't have time to do. So I'm very happy about that. So I wanted to share that with the AAC as well. Of course, it'll be money. Can we find the resources? But the city seems to have a very good way of finding resources for things like that, for green energy and for progress and technology. I'm hopeful that we can find some funding to do a feasibility study and start moving solar forward on the airport. So I wanted to add that to my report. Otherwise, I'm happy to answer any questions about anything I shared in my previous report.
All right, Arnaud, I think, yeah, you had a hand. Go ahead.
Thank you, John. I see a couple complaints there in April about low-flying helicopters at night. Anybody has any information on that?
I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think that got covered. I believe the tower chief reported those were coming from Washington State headed for California. They weren't local helicopters, and they were down low because of instrument. I mean, they were below the clouds. I think there were 3, if I remember the story correctly.
3, it looks like 3 military Chinooks, it looks like.
Yep, I actually saw them from up here. This is Cat Pence, by the way. Sorry, my camera's not working today. I live at about 500 feet, and they were probably at 700 or so feet and just following the valley floor. 3 Chinooks, and they were going north when I saw them. So I don't know if they came through twice, but it was crazy. It was very cool to see.
Got a lot of noise complaints today about the National Guard F-15 flyover. I guess they were doing an Armed Forces Day presentation. They did some rip roaring over the city, the Capitol building today, and so some of the citizens weren't happy about that, mainly because they didn't know, not because they're not supportive of it. So I've asked a couple of folks to reach out to the National Guard or the Oregon Military Department to see if there's a way that they can let us know in advance, if we can push that out through the city's Facebook page and other social media resources to let the community know when the military department's going to do flybys. The regular military is unlikely to want to cooperate with that because aircraft movements are not something they share. But I think if the National Guard is going to do some sort of a flyby or some special occasion, they can certainly let the city know. So we're dealing with that this afternoon.
One of the guys said the F-15 pilot went vertical over the airport.
I don't know if it was quite like that. I would like to have had them do a low pass over the airport and go vertical. That would have been great, but not over the downtown area or some of the neighborhoods that called me.
That sounds spectacular. Should
I
I
also
take
saw that one was very cool.
Should I take what happens with the helicopters was unavoidable because of weather circumstances? Is that what I heard?
I don't know if we know that. I think that's an assumption that was being made. Typically, when helicopters will fly below the cloud deck when they're transiting north-south, sometimes that's what they'll do just to stay on a visual flight plan instead of an instrument flight plan. But my experience, the regular Army or the Air Force, typically the Army around here, as they're moving from base to base up and down the West Coast, they'll fly where and when and how they want. They don't have any obligation to tell us if it's during air traffic control hours and they're transiting through our airspace, which is below 2,500 feet, then they have to talk to the tower. If at nighttime and the tower's closed, it's uncontrolled airspace. So they can and will do what they like. Sometimes they'll give us the courtesy if they're doing a training evolution at night. They'll let us know so we can let folks know, but not always. That's not the military way for the most part.
Okay, thank you, John.
Thank you.
Other questions? I have a couple, short, hopefully. Any updates from since your report on how the job search has been going for the 2 openings?
I do. Thank you for asking. So I have hired a badging and credentialing coordinator. I'm pilfering somebody from PDX who wants to not have to drive to Portland any longer. It lives down this way in Silverton. So he'll be starting on June 5th. So that'll be great. Security manager position that I had hired that we lost at the last minute due to a family emergency. That's been reposted. It closes on Monday. I've got several candidates lined up for that. I visited with one today, someone that I know already personally, not personally, but professionally, but I know him. The administrative analyst position, I was just before this meeting started, I was going through 50 applications and scoring those. So So that position we'll be interviewing in the next couple of weeks for that position. That'll be our full-time admin. Some of you may recall that we've always had a half-time administrative assistant out here that we share with urban development. Up until recently, that was Irma Rivera. We've had Darcy Palmer in the past and some others. We're going to have our own full-time administrative analyst and staff assistant now, so that'll be fantastic. So I expect that position will be ramping up here towards the end of June. Security manager should be on board in July, and that won't hold up air service at all. I'm an airport security coordinator, qualified airport manager, so I'll act as the security coordinator or security manager until we get one. So there's no delay there. And then the last sort of operations maintenance position that we have to hire for, I've got 49 applications sitting at my desk. I have 99 applications on my desk right now that I have to score. So we're moving along quickly. It's a long way of answering your question to say there's a lot of applications, a lot of good qualified candidates, a lot of work to do the HR side of it. But I think that we'll be fully staffed up here at the airport with all the positions filled probably no later than mid-July.
That's great. That's great.
Moving along.
And any other public things you can share about the commercial service, when they might be starting?
What I can share from a meeting we had this morning, we have an every other week meeting with the TSA, with the airline that's not to be named, with city staff, project management staff. We had that meeting this morning. We believe that we're on track for having our security plan approved and our construction project done roughly around the same time, which we'll just say mid-June. Sort of a target time. The airline has said that they're comfortable with making an announcement publicly once the ASP, the airport security plan, has been approved by the TSA. So that could be as early as mid-June because they like 60 to 75 days to announce and sell tickets and do all their marketing. So extrapolating out from there, it's probably mid to late August, maybe early September. They haven't made a decision yet on an actual launch date, but between now and mid-June, they'll likely come up with that. They are talking about adding a second city very shortly after they launch their first city. So there's some discussion there. And so they're pleased with the progress. Obviously, they wanted it to be faster. They really wanted to be operating here in May before Memorial Day, but it takes the time that it takes, but we are on track. Everybody's on the same page. It's been going nonstop since January when we started this. Actually started at about this time last year. So I think they're happy. The TSA is happy. The city's happy. Everybody's just anxious. But we're on track, and knock on wood, there's not been any roadblocks or deal killers or anything. So I feel pretty good about the meeting we had this morning.
I was really skeptical when I heard the first dates, and you guys are coming in pretty dang close. So I think you're doing a great job.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Everybody's pulled out all the stops. I actually would publicly in this meeting, I will thank the TSA because I've worked with a lot of TSA, much like the FAA in different regions around the United States. You get different folks. The folks that I work with here in the Portland and Eugene offices have been absolutely fantastic to work with. They've been very accommodating. They're working nights and weekends with me. We're trading emails on the weekends and editing and reviewing chapters of the security plan. So they're pulling out all the stops too. They really don't want to be the holdup, and they haven't been. So I've been thrilled to work with them, and I think they feel the same way. And I think that, long term, the relationship long term is really going to benefit Salem when it comes to, enforcement, regulatory enforcement, requests that we may make to change our security plan. There'll be the benefit of the doubt if there's a gray area. I think that's important for us long term. So it's been good that we haven't had the adversarial relationship that some airport managers have with their TSA or FAA counterparts. We don't operate that way here in the city of Salem, and long term that serves us really, really well. So I appreciate their efforts as well.
Well, that's great. All right. Any last questions for John on his report? All right, if none, the next agenda item would be action items, and I don't believe we had anything on the agenda at this time. So we can move on to items for commission discussion. And then I guess I didn't have anything there. Did any other folks, anything anybody else wants to bring up? All right, if not, then I think since there's no chair's report, I think we could just move on to adjourning the meeting. So thank you everyone for attending and all your time. And again, great work, John, with getting things moving on the air service. Yeah, looking forward to meeting the few of you who are involved in the airport master plan committee next week. So thank you very
Oh, that's
much.
right. Yep, very good. Thank you,
Sure.
Councilor Nishioka, for your attendance tonight too. It's great to have you here. Look